It's a real pleasure to see you all here in the room and online. And welcome to this ICC ASP side event that we have called Preventing Genocide and a Humanitarian Catastrophe in Sudan. A very timely and tragically relevant event. I'm joined today, my name is Charlotte. I'm a human rights officer and the head of advocacy at Global Human Rights Defense. And I will be your moderator for today. And I'm joined today by a really, really high level panel, which we're extremely proud to have, which you see to my left and right. And then also we are joined by a fourth speaker online. I will be introducing them in due time. I would like to thank the speakers in advance for making the time and showing up today. And I would like to thank, of course, the team at GHRD for making this come together. Now, I think you're all familiar, but for the sake of having the context there, preventing genocide and a humanitarian catastrophe is not something that we say lightly. I think we all know that the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF have been at war in Sudan since April 2023, And since then, it has developed into one of the largest, if not the largest, humanitarian crisis that we currently have on record. According to data from the IOM and the UNHCR, 30 out of 48 million Sudanese people currently require humanitarian assistance. We have 9 million internally displaced people. 12 million Sudanese are displaced beyond their borders, most of them fleeing into Chad, which means that 1 in 3 Sudanese people, as we speak, has been displaced. And many of them have been displaced not just once, not just twice, but multiple times. And in addition to that, Sudan also continues to host over 900,000 refugees from South Sudan, from Ethiopia, and other contexts. Now, of course, when we think about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, one thing that immediately comes to mind is the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, particularly by the RSF. I'm not going to go into details about it now, I'm sure our speakers will. But this is something I think that continues to strike me the most about this crisis. These unprecedented levels of violence, of brutality, that we see and that are out there for most of us to see. I'm sure everybody who's been online in the past couple of days, especially with the recapture of Al-Fashir, has seen the brutal images coming out of that. Of course, we have our hotspots in Darfur and in the Kordofans, but I think it's safe to say that protection risks still exist also in Khartoum, in Al Jazeera. We've seen the cholera outbreak very recently in Al Jazeera, and this is just contributing to this massive humanitarian crisis. Now, as I said, we saw, unfortunately, the fall of Al-Fashir this November to the RSF, which I think can safely be described as one of the most brutal things that I personally have ever had to encounter in my career as a human rights lawyer and a humanitarian. We saw killings, mass executions, sexual violence. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but you could see the blood from space at times. There were satellite images circulating where you could see the blood that had been spilled in the streets in and around Al-Fashir. So far, 70,000 people have fled Al-Fashir, most of them on the road to Tawila, which has since then gained an infamous reputation of the road of torture. Along this route, people face extortion, abduction, violence, rape, and death. Particularly within the last few days, we've seen alarming reports of children making their way all by themselves from Al-Fashir to Tawila. And 200,000 Sudanese citizens remain trapped in Al-Fashir, and they face acute food insecurity. The IPC-5 condition of famine has been confirmed recently. And this means concretely that 2 adults and 4 children per 10,000 inhabitants die each day. And I think we need to keep in mind that there's 200,000 people left in Al-Fasher, so I'll let you do the math of that. What we have seen, and speaking from this from a humanitarian point of view, is that moving aid and also humanitarian workers, specifically through the Adra crossing into Al-Fasher, remains extremely dangerous. The ERC Tom Fletcher was down, I think about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. He was down, and he also reported that even though they made the way they landed in Port Sudan, and they made the way all the way through the Adra crossing, and stopped just before Al-Fasher because it was determined it was too dangerous to go. He said he had to negotiate access. He passed about 40 checkpoints. He had to negotiate access in every single one of them. So the moving of aid and of workers has been extremely dangerous and extremely cumbersome. But I do not want to talk only about Al-Fasher, because I know that even though this is at the top of everybody's minds, I think it's very important that we do not lose sight of what is going on in the Kordofans in the rest of the country. I think it's very important to keep in mind, for example, Al-Ubaid. And when we speak about preventing genocide and a humanitarian catastrophe, we need to see exactly that what we have seen happening in Al-Fasher does not also happen in Al-Ubaid. Now, of course, what we've also seen are attacks on humanitarian workers on a quite unprecedented scale. 21 humanitarian aid workers have died this year already in Sudan, which is a gross violation of IHL. I've been in a briefing with Tom Fletcher last week, where he recounted about his visit to Sudan, and he said it is probably the worst year on record to be a humanitarian worker, because aid is instrumentalized. The convoys are accompanied all the time, and I think we've all heard about the UNICEF convoy, for example, being struck. And well, as I said, we've lost 21 workers, colleagues this year in Sudan already. I think what also bears the short notice here is money, which I think, as we all know, is short in this situation. The humanitarian appeal for Sudan remains over 70% not funded. Currently, we're standing at 28% funding this year for 2025. Which means that out of the $6 billion that would be needed, hardly one has been received so far. So the 3 key things that I would like for us to keep in mind during this discussion is what I think we're all calling for is unimpeded humanitarian access, political pressure for a ceasefire, because without peace there will be no lasting solution, and then of course investigations and accountability for all the violations of IHL and of human rights law that are taking place. I'm sure most of you are familiar, but just to recap, the UN Security Council has referred the situation in Darfur to the ICC under its resolution 1593, which has been now 2 decades ago, which is one of the reasons why we've brought this panel together, to kind of take stock at this point in time of what has happened. Of course, we've all seen on October 6th, when Ali Kushayb was found guilty on 27 counts of war crimes, and I think this has been a very important step, also considering that gender-based persecution has been recognized as a crime against humanity finally. But it also keeps bearing in mind that this is the only former militia leader that the ICC has been able to persecute within 2 decades. And then, of course, any atrocities outside of Darfur remain outside the jurisdiction of the ICC until it is expanded, for which we would, of course, in the best case scenario, need the consent of the government of Sudan. So most victims remain without accountability for now. Of course, jurisdiction expansion would be a way to fix the issue, but today we will also be looking at complementary transitional justice pathways. On November 14 this year, the Human Rights Council has established by resolution a new fact-finding inquiry into al-Fasher specifically, which I would like to welcome at this point as a good starting point for an ICC investigation. Then most recently, the report that we've seen from the previous UN fact-finding mission has been on the 21st of October, and already there, even though of course this is a human rights report and this does not adhere to the strict standards of criminal law, of international criminal law, already the fact-finding mission has concluded that there are large-scale violations of human rights law and of international humanitarian law, which may amount to war crimes, and in the case of the RSF, also to crimes against humanity. It has found pervasive sexual and gender-based violence, including girls as young as 12. Many of these targeting non-Arab communities, specifically with an ethnic dimension, so the Fur people, the Masalit people, bear a very disproportionate burden. The report from the fact-finding mission also documents systematic destruction of essential infrastructure for survival. And this is all, in light of this, I think it is all the more important that we start talking concretely about assuring accountability and reparations for victims, because at the end of the day, the credibility of the international system as a whole is at stake here in Sudan. And now I think I've spoken enough. I've given a bit of a lengthy introduction here. So without further ado, I would like to move to our first speaker, which is Sara Senieri. And Sara is an international human rights lawyer who provides legal representation and strategic consulting to individuals, corporations, governments, and non-governmental organizations. Her areas of expertise include international law, human rights, war crimes, cross-border finance, and foreign policy. And she serves as vice chair of the War Crimes Committee at the International Bar Association, which promotes global justice and advances the principle of accountability with a focus on atrocity crimes and international criminal law. It also offers a forum for practitioners and scholars, along with reliable resources and an international network of experts. Sara will be outlining the challenges related to evidence collection in Sudan, the documentation of atrocities, and the work of the UN fact-finding mission. So without further ado, Sara, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful overview about Sudan, and thank you to all of you who are here. We actually did change things. Emma's going to talk about investigations and fact-finding. I don't know if you want her to go first, and then me, or if you want me to just go ahead and talk about accountability.
Then
and such.
You go.
Okay. Great. So you've heard quite a bit already about just the scale and the depth of the atrocities in Sudan, a conflict that has been ignored both back previously, but also now with the rise in hostilities. I think what is most important to keep in mind as we talk about accountability in Sudan is the fact that the crimes being committed are very individualized. They are very, very personal. These are more one-on-one offenses that you're seeing, which when you contrast with conflicts like Gaza, where you have just widespread atrocious bombing campaigns of civilian areas, the crimes being committed in Sudan are very, very personal. And that is something that I think we need to keep in mind when we do talk about accountability and reconciliation and rebuilding of the country. I'm not going to go over everything that Charlotte so eloquently explained, but a few things I just want to add on the ICC mandate. Yes, we need to expand that, but as we all know, the UN Security Council has been just at an impasse and is one of the biggest frustrations to international criminal justice. And this is something we're heavily pushing the UK on, given that they are the pen holder, but if we can expand that jurisdiction. But I don't think the focus, and it may be faux pas to say that as we sit here, but I don't think the focus should be on the ICC. They certainly have an important role to play, but I think that we need to think creatively at this point. Additionally, when I was in the region earlier this year, as I've worked with a lot of the Sudanese diaspora, and Mu'tasim, I'm sure, can talk about this as well, there is a lack of hope and faith in the ICC from almost every group that I talk to. They feel that the ICC has failed, that it will not do anything, and they do not expect to see justice from it. And so I think that's also a very important thing that we keep in mind as we think about what we want to do. One aspect that I do think the international community can address, and can address it immediately, is the use of targeted, individualized sanctions. Granted, and in that vein, understanding that, as we sit here with a court that is under sanctions from the US, the UN has had sanctions regimes and an arms embargo under. For those need to be expanded. The individual sanctions need to be expanded. We've seen the US and the EU, I believe Canada as well, has imposed some limited targeted sanctions on individuals and most importantly companies. But that is one way that we can act immediately as an international community, pushing the EU, pushing individual countries not only to impose sanctions on individuals, on companies, on the enablers, but then to actually enforce them and have meaningful enforcement, target those who, just as we've been doing with Russia and Ukraine, we can do the exact same thing. The model is there. The example is there. We just need to have the political will within countries to do that. And as you all know from the Ukraine-Russia situation, this can provide for the freezing of funds, the use of those funds for reparations in the future, for rebuilding. But another aspect of this is if we go after those who are violating and helping those evade sanctions, there are fines and penalties that the criminal courts in most countries can impose. Those fines and penalties can be used for reparations and to fund the rebuilding and accountability efforts. So there are mechanisms available, but we need to think creatively. Tangentially on that, I think countries should also look at, and I know Rodney's going to talk more about universal jurisdiction and those things for atrocity crimes, but I think we need to look at other offenses, step out of the genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, but look at other offenses that we can pursue against international actors in states. Look at corporate crimes, look at bribery, corruption, theft of resources. Anything else that can be pursued against these actors can again not only be a deterrent, can be something investors can look at to say, we have obligations to our shareholders, to our boards, and we cannot accept this risk. We cannot accept the potential for liability. But those offenses also often carry very significant forfeitures and fines that can be used. So from an outset, I think this is one area that we need to look at, and whether we push countries to use Global Magnitsky, anti-corruption. In the UK, you have the Proceeds of Crime Act. Whatever we can use to start going after what is feeding and financing this war will help to put a stop to it. I won't go into detail because there's a great event tomorrow night, but I think the BNB Paribas case out of the United States with the recent judgment, yes, it's going up on appeal. There are already squabbles as to which lawyers are going to handle disbursement of funds once received. And there's a side event tomorrow night that I'd flag for all of you on reparations, and they're going to specifically address the BNP Paribas case. But I think that's something that needs to be looked at more broadly for some of the other financiers and others. In terms of peace and accountability mechanisms, the first thing I want to say at the outset is that this needs to be Sudanese-led. It has to involve Sudanese civil society, both the peace negotiations, which they've largely been left out of, but accountability efforts have to be led by the Sudanese people. Understanding this is from a broad range of populations, of tribes, of ethnic groups, of religious groups, but women also have to be at the forefront of this. And there have to be specific designations for women's involvement, women's protection, and aspects of accountability specifically pertaining to women. As Charlotte said, the sexual violence in Sudan is just, I have no words to talk about it. And this has been generational. It's been ongoing for decades. And so as we look to these things, I think those are the two things that are most important that we have to consider. With that said, we've been working on ideas and suggestions and things that we hope that, there's so many skilled Sudanese lawyers and judges and experts in the diaspora and still within Sudan that we hope we can work with this. One thing that we've been looking at is to do something a bit new and unique, recognizing that there are all of these different accountability mechanisms that have been effective, somewhat effective in the past in different things. But one thing that I think will be important, especially for Sudan, is to create a bit of a board that would oversee and coordinate, that as we develop all these accountability mechanisms, they should be developed together. They should be developed with understanding of how they're going to share evidence, how they're going to handle things, and coordinate those efforts instead of having things siloed. Yes, we do have the ICC, but that's not going to be the primary form of accountability. And I think if we have a coalition or a committee or something to oversee how we pursue accountability, that will help in a number of aspects. There have been a number of proposals for a hybrid tribunal. Yes, the creation of tribunals is expensive, but I think something that has been effective in other scenarios in the past but could be very successful for Sudan is to have a hybrid court within the Sudanese judicial system. Yes, there are reforms needed. Yes, there are issues in their laws, but having a blending of domestic and international with an eventual transition to a domestic-only tribunal. Legislative reforms will be needed for this. Some of those have been started in Sudan, but then with the resumption of hostilities in 2023 have gone to the wayside. But there are also concerns with Sudanese law where it doesn't conform with international law and international standards. There are wide immunity provisions, which would allow for the avoidance of accountability by a number of perpetrators in the security services, military, and government. And so that is something that would need to be addressed. That being said, it's not a given the individualized nature of the crimes in this conflict. They can still pursue crimes of murder, rape, torture, and other standard criminal offenses, even if they don't call them war crimes or crimes against humanity. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind, especially about this conflict. With this, I think something that's also important is that we do not need to wait for a peace agreement or a ceasefire to start these processes. Thinking back to the former Yugoslavia, in this situation, we can start putting these mechanisms together. We can start building them. We can start providing trainings to lawyers, to judges, to law enforcement, working with the diaspora. And I think that's something that when you look at all of the trainings that the international community did for Ukraine, when you look at all of the resources that were poured in to ongoing prosecutions in Ukraine as we sit here today and the war is still going on, why are we not doing that for Sudan? Why can the international community not step up and do the same thing? We have the models, we have the mechanisms, we have the resources, we have the expertise. And I think that's something we all need to push NGOs, bar associations, all of the same actors that stood up and devoted extensive resources to do this in Ukraine, to turn around and do the same for Sudan. The final things I'll mention just in kind of what this multifaceted accountability effort should look like. Sudan does have a rich tradition of traditional courts, the Judea. These can be used for restorative justice. Traditionally, they're used more for economic or commercial transactions, but there is faith in these. They do take into consideration local customs, local norms, and when you look at Rwanda, when you look at Uganda, when you look at other contexts, I think this is something when you look towards truth and reconciliation, when you look at restorative justice, when you consider that you're going to have fighters coming back from the battlefield living in the same towns and cities and villages, I think that this is something that cannot be overlooked, especially because accountability is just not going to be possible for everyone. Just briefly to conclude, some other considerations that I think are important as we consider accountability efforts, restorative justice, and some of this was gleaned from my meetings in the region, in Sudan, in South Sudan, with some of the Sudanese diaspora who had fled, first and foremost, I think managing expectations is important, and that's something else we can start doing now. If you've not read it, Caleb Wheeler had an excellent book come out last year where he talked about how international criminal justice often fails victims because for many of them, a prison sentence is never long enough for the person who killed their family member or raped their wife or their daughter in front of them. And working with survivors, working with victims' families, and helping them understand the limits of justice and accountability and how to manage what they will expect from these processes, I think is something we should also start working on now. Mental health is absolutely vital for this. I'm a trustee with a charity in the UK called Beyond Conflict that focuses on trauma support for survivors as well as for frontline responders. And that mental health is something that is absolutely vital, especially for those who are going to be involved in the accountability processes. And that has to be something continuing, both from the initial encounter with survivors all the way through to the prosecution, sentencing, and aftermath. It cannot be avoided. And that goes especially for the ICC. Education will be vital for this. If we want to avoid the generational trauma, the repeat of hostilities, the hate, the racism, the other things that pervade through generations, especially populations that either have known nothing but conflict in their country or those who've seen conflict after conflict. And so we need to focus on the educational system as well and ensure that that's an avenue that people can address. Additionally, we have thousands of children who have been out of school. It's left them vulnerable, and that is something that needs to be kept in mind in these efforts. Going back to the conflict-related sexual violence, stigma is something that truly needs to be addressed in these communities, and that's both for men and for women, for survivors, for their family members, avoiding crimes against these individuals. Oftentimes they're forced out of their communities, and so we must work with community leaders, religious leaders, the next governance of Sudan, but stigma must be a part of this to ensure that the survivors of sexual violence are enabled and empowered to live productive lives and given that independence. Part of this will also involve medical care. Starvation in Sudan, as you all know, it is the worst humanitarian crisis. And what that does for the development of children, of humans, as the reports we're already seeing out of Gaza, for how the impact of starvation and lack of access to clean water, the long-term medical effects of that, we are going to see that tenfold in Sudan. And so that has to be part of this as well. The final thing I will then just note as we look at this accountability, rebuilding, reconciliation, we must have oversight and transparency in the rebuilding process. Sudan deserves to profit from its resources, from everything that it has in its land. It cannot allow external actors to continue looting its resources. And so we have to ensure that, when, inshallah, this rebuilding process happens, that we don't have corruption, we don't have the looting of resources, and that we ensure that there's lasting peace in Sudan and lasting profitability and success for this country. So with that, I'll turn back over to you.
Thank you very much for these insights on accountability. I will be opening the floor later for questions, so if you have any, please keep them in the back of your mind. And I will then now move to Emma. Emma Di Napoli is an associate legal advisor at Eyewitness to Atrocities, which is a London-based organization that focuses on securing documentation of atrocity crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, through the use of secure, verifiable digital evidence. And she will present how combining technology, it's been a long day for me too, with legal expertise can help ensure that more on-the-ground visual evidence is incorporated into investigations and can support accountability efforts. Prior to this role, Emma has also worked at the ICC and in the office of Amal Clooney. And she also worked at Redress in London, where she led the organization's work on transitional justice in Sudan. and her work there included developing strategic litigation, preparing sanctions submissions, and coordinating advocacy. So please, Emma, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I thought I would start by, and thank you for the introduction. I thought I would start by taking liberty of just explaining perhaps a bit of Eyewitness's work and what Eyewitness is, and then talking about some of the challenges facing documenters in Sudan and what that means for the sort of evidence that emerges from Sudan. I will also note, though, that we have several fabulous human rights defenders from Sudan here in the room, so they are actually the best positioned to speak to these, and I think maybe especially in the Q&A it would be good to direct questions to them. I'm looking at everyone on this side of the room. But so Eyewitness to Atrocities is an initiative that was started and housed within the International Bar Association, and we essentially run a controlled capture application that allows documenters to take footage with embedded metadata that can't be altered. And what I mean by that is if you take a photo on your regular camera, it's quite easy actually to change the time, date, and location, which makes it difficult to know where a photo came from and whether it's authentic. And the Eyewitness app solves for that, really. So you take a photo within the application, and then you upload it to a secure server that's only accessible to Eyewitness, so it's not accessible to the public. And in the process of uploading, the photo is, or video or audio file, whatever it is basically hashed, which means there's a secure kind of a digital code attached to that image that's unverified when it reaches the server. And this means that we know that the photo hasn't been altered, and this can be proven if a case arose, where a court wanted to see how evidence had been gathered and where it was taken. And the app was developed after years of consultations, so with both lawyers and human rights activists to try to determine what kind of security measures might be helpful and are built within the app itself, as well as the kind of evidentiary standards you need. And of course, digital evidence is a sort of new field within the international criminal law space, so there are still relatively few cases where digital evidence has been used, and this is partially a reflection of how few cases there are just in general. So I can talk a little bit about some of the security features, but not at great length. The app is obscured on your phone, so it's less easily found if your phone is searched. And photos that you take are, as I said, housed within a secure gallery, so distinct from your phone gallery. And then, of course, if you're interested in the specific features of the app, we can talk about that afterwards. And the app is free to use, I should say. It is only available on Android phones because the Android phones have allow for the app to function fully, whereas the Apple platform doesn't allow for location services to be used in the same way and for full anonymity, which is important. So users can use the app with their name if they chose. They can provide an email address if they'd like, but you can also use the app fully anonymously. And we do often work with organizations who sign MOUs, so we know who might be documenting from our particular organization, which is helpful when we transfer footage back to users, because the documenters remain the owners of the footage they take. We just sort of protect it in the server. So that's a really brief overview of Eyewitness, and I am happy to answer questions about the technology in the Q&A if that's helpful. But I thought I'd also I would turn then to addressing some challenges that documenters face. And I know lots of us work in this space, and so we'll already actually be quite familiar. But I think the predominant risk is really a safety one. So safety and security of documenters in Sudan is really poor, and I think the security situation for documenters has deteriorated significantly since the war began, but even in recent months has actually gotten much worse. So it's sort of a rapidly deteriorating situation. In parts of Darfur, for example, the RSF has systematically targeted human rights activists, journalists, lawyers. We know in Jenaina, in West Darfur, that there were actually lists that were circulating in the months before the mid-June attack on Jenaina, the concentrated attack that occurred in 2023. And in El Fasher recently, we also know that journalists and human rights defenders were targeted, either targeted in drone strikes or arrested and disappeared, and some of their whereabouts remain unknown. And this, of course, has a chilling effect on documentation. There is also the dynamic where you have documenters, ordinary civilians and others who, in the course of traveling, as Charlotte indicated, are stopped at checkpoints and phones are seized, searched, and confiscated. And this is obviously quite risky for people. And the result was, I think, that people didn't really document what they were seeing. Or if they did document what they were seeing, that evidence has since been lost. I've also heard from documenters and witnesses that evidence has been buried. So in Geneva, for example, many people described having hard drives or USB sticks with data, but that they remain buried in a yard somewhere. And with limited access to Geneva, that evidence remains unrecoverable, and I suspect much of it is corrupted anyway, just because it's rained, for example. So I think in addition to there not being much documentation being taken, there's also been a chilling effect on how it's disseminated. So at the beginning of the conflict, we did see actually floods of information being posted to the extent that there was Wi-Fi, and I'll talk about that after this. But now there's been a remarkable lack of evidence emerging from some places where you would assume that information would be circulating either on WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter, so some of the kind of usual channels where you see information coming from Sudan. And of course, internet connectivity and data play a big role in this. So there were government-enforced shutdowns and blackouts at the beginning of the conflict that were quite long. It made it impossible to get information in and out of Sudan. Now you have a situation where perhaps the government or the RSF army aren't intentionally shutting down the internet, but blackouts remain, and connectivity is very spotty. So you tend to get people online at like 7 p.m. Sudan time, 8 p.m. Sudan time, but in the middle of the day, it's really difficult to reach people, and I think you can probably all attest to this as well. We also know that groups, and this is to the credit of international groups, many are actually distributing Starlinks through Sudan, but those are often confiscated. And so you have this kind of short-term Starlink access where maybe a group has Starlink or a community has one device, and then those go offline, and consequently people are just offline once again. And so where you need data to upload information, this is true both for the use of the Eyewitness app, where you need to have data to upload to the server, but also just to use social media. It makes it really difficult to get evidence out, and especially like larger files that require significant bandwidth. I think there's also a major funding constraints for Sudanese organizations that has had an effect on the ability for documenters to carry out their work. It's sort of been alluded to already, but the Trump cuts have really massively hit Sudanese organizations. So there's been a lot of work over the years, I mean, not since 2023, but really decades of work to build networks of really experienced, talented, committed documenters who are now struggling to keep people working, and that's compounded by the humanitarian crisis. So where people have shortages of food, water, the basic necessities for life, it's a really difficult picture for people to be carrying out documentation work. I also wanted to highlight some of the broader strategic questions, I think, in terms of how people are documenting. And this is not necessarily a capacity gap, because many people have worked on this. Sudanese organizations have talked about this for a long time, but in the absence of really clear accountability mechanisms, so okay, you have the ICC in Darfur, but in other parts of Sudan, it becomes difficult to know for what purpose you're documenting, and this has implications for the kind of evidence you're gathering. And we talk a lot about the kinds of investigations plans people should be developing, but where there are questions about how, to what standard does evidence need to be gathered? What elements of the crimes are you trying to gather for? I mean, to your point on ordinary crimes, or are you trying to capture evidence that gets to also that shows a systematic attack or a widespread attack? Without a sort of clear vision or target recipient for this information, I think it makes the work of documenters difficult, because there are so many violations to potentially capture, that where you have a limited resource picture, I think documentation can then inevitably become a bit scattered. And I think we saw this at the court to some extent. We received a lot of open source information, for example. None of it really got to, or some of it got to the elements that we were looking at, but it was still very difficult to build a picture from the information that was gathered. So I think there is still some technical capacity building work that would be helpful, and I would be very interested in Sudanese colleagues' views on this, like what international organizations could be doing to better facilitate this. But I think it's still a bit of coalition building around the kinds of crimes that are being documented, and then who the recipient might be. So, okay, the fact-finding mission, is it the ICC? What would it be in the context of crimes committed in Omdurman, where the ICC has no jurisdiction? So, and maybe one more point just on the technical questions. There is also the question about how information is stored or archived or transmitted. And the eyewitness application is obviously one solution to a problem if you're documenting, if you're doing audio-visual documentation, but eyewitness is not really intended for taking of witness statements, for example. It's really meant for videos, audio files, and photos. So how do groups store information if they are really primarily doing witness testimony, and how are those saved to a high evidentiary standard? So I think these are questions that people are doing a lot of thinking around, but are big challenges that have implications for future accountability. I think it'd be great to have a discussion around that. So I guess, where does that leave us in terms of evidence? As I said, I think it's been surprising in some ways, but unsurprising in others, how little evidence has come or information has come from places like Al-Fasher, or more recently West Kordofan and South Kordofan, where the RSF, we know, is advancing and conflict is escalating. And there was some documentary evidence from perpetrators, which I'll talk about in a minute, of those killed in and around Al-Fasher. And there is documentation of injuries from those who've arrived in IDP camps around Al-Fasher, for example, including in Chad. And we have seen witness testimony about what they face. So there is good testimonial evidence that groups like Mohammed down at the ends, the Darfur Network, is capturing this information. But interestingly, the best footage has come from the RSF itself. So there was a flood of really gruesome videos, as you said, Charlotte, when Al-Fasher fell, that were all taken by the RSF. And that obviously has significant evidentiary value. So we saw, even outside of Al-Fasher, in Ardamata, we saw the fall of the SAF garrison there. In late autumn 2023, there was just the capture of Baba Nusa, the SAF garrison yesterday. So those were all RSF videos. And of course, it's difficult for documenters or civilians to capture footage from the moment they're being attacked. So this is to be expected. But what has been interesting is how little footage there is now emerging, though we know that atrocities have been committed. And I think that is because of both the security risks that people face and internet connectivity. There have also been interesting videos from RSF regarding defections to the RSF. So, and this was a little bit more in 2023, 2024, but when SAF or other forces joined the RSF, there were often videos of those, which can be useful to some extent. There were also videos of RSF commanders speaking at different points, which have limited linkage value, but also just are good to, it shows where perpetrators may have been at a certain time. But the evidence related to kind of the aftermath of attacks has been surprisingly limited. So maybe I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer questions. But that's just sort of an overview of how documentation is being carried out in Sudan, and what that means for future case building.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really, really comprehensive overview about what Eyewitness is doing and the state of documentation in Sudan currently. I would now like to move to our speaker who is joining us online, Mutasim Ali. I think, yes, it looks like he can hear us. That's great.
Yes, I can.
Hello. Mutasim is a legal advisor at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He has a lot of expertise in international criminal law, international human rights and humanitarian law, transitional justice, and targeted human rights protection. And through his work with the center, he has monitored the escalation of the conflict in Sudan, documenting human rights violations that include ethnically motivated killings, systematic SGBV, mass displacement, and a man-made famine of unprecedented scale in recent history. In April 2024, the center has issued an inquiry concluding that the RSF and allied militias are carrying out systematic attacks and atrocities in West Darfur, including direct and public incitement to genocide. The inquiry also found that certain external actors are complicit through extensive financial, political, and military support to the RSF. So Mutazim will now hopefully share some of those findings with us, and he will also discuss the involvement of external actors, including support provided by the UAE to the RSF and the use of mercenaries in the conflict. So, Mutazim, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlotte. I think this is a great and timely event, and I'm also pleased to be part of this esteemed colleagues. I've been working with you quite some time, and the situation in Sudan is becoming really more complex, not only in terms of the atrocities, but also in terms of the actors involved. Initially, this started as a war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, but then we saw that many domestic actors also involved in the conflict, and so that made it really a lot more complicated to resolve. But I think what is even more complicated is the involvement of external actors fueling the atrocities. I think the tragedy that we're facing is not the issue of law. I think the law is there, whether the international law or even other regimes that are supposed to respond to these atrocities, whether those regimes are targeted sanctions or other forms of accountability. I think the dilemma that we're facing is the lack of political will. And that is really the major issue that we're facing. Of course, you all know that the conflict in Sudan is, this is not just the conflict that began in April 2023, right? This is part of the Sudan's long struggle. Basically, we've been in a perpetual state of conflict in Sudan. And so I think that is really important to keep in mind. For the state has been relying consistently throughout the history in creating militias to respond to legitimate political claims and the like. But I think what we need to focus on is two major things. One is, given the situation that we're seeing today, especially in Al-Fashir, where we all predicted what was going to happen, and it was, because we've seen that in El Geneina, West Darfur, where the RSF and allied militias targeted the Masalit. And then we've seen that in the Zamzam IDP camp. We knew that Al-Fashir would be even worse, in the sense that Al-Fashir is in the middle of nowhere. So basically, targeted groups could not escape to nowhere. Basically, a lot of people now in Tawila, which is about 60 kilometers away from Al-Fashir, and Tawila itself is not a safe area. And therefore, the focus should be, number one, is really preventing further atrocities from happening, right? We know that Al-Fashir is not the end, because we have seen this before. And this is going to be an issue in Darfur, but also, as mentioned earlier, other parts of the country in West Kordofan, North Kordofan, South Kordofan, and maybe onwards. And so the focus really should be on the atrocity prevention, rather than focusing on how can we resolve I mean, making peace in the country, right? That is number one. And number two, the issue of the cessation of hostilities, because as long as the warring parties engage um, in conflict, these atrocities will continue to occur. And I say cessation of hostilities to distinguish between ending violence in its negative sense, basically making peace in negative sense, but basically no more shootings and killings, and peace process where a lot of people and Sudanese broader society should engage. But I want to just circle back a little bit in terms of the gravity of the situation that we're seeing in Darfur. Of course, in 2024, as mentioned earlier, we at the Raoul Wallenberg Center, we released a report where we concluded that genocide has been committed by the RSF and allied militia against the Masalit in West Darfur. But we also concluded that the risk of another genocide in other parts of the country, particularly North Darfur against the Zagao community. This is one of the things that we already mentioned in 2024. But the major part of our report, from my perspective at least, is identifying external actors enabling and complicit in genocide. Of course, the UAE is the principal actor in fueling the atrocities, supporting the RSF, but we also identified other external actors, including Chad, with Wagner, Russia via the Wagner Group, Central African Republic, but also Sudan as a state for creating the RSF in the first place. And the idea is, by identifying these external actors, is to say that if we want to end these atrocities, we need to cut off the perpetrators, whether those are the RSF or allied militias, or maybe SAF and allied militias and the like, from the funding sources that allow them to continue the atrocities. We've been focusing primarily on the UAE because we know that the UAE is the principal back of the RSF. And just want to give you a quick example, let alone all the atrocities in Al Janin and Zamzam for internally displaced persons camp in April 2025. From the U.S. intelligence community said that the UAE actually ramped up, sort of their support for the RSF in days leading up to the capture of Al-Fashir. This is from the U.S. intelligence community, and of course there are additional reports about sort of the UAE support for the RSF. Surely the UAE continues to deny these allegations, but it failed, or maybe refused to offer any evidence that suggests, that they were not supporting the RSF. So we know that the UAE has been heavily involved in funding the RSF and sending arms and financial resources. But I should note also that that the Sudanese armed forces, on its part, is also getting a lot of support from external actors. We know that for sure, but the complexity of making that argument against the Sudanese armed forces is that it is acting as a state entity, and so they say we have the legitimacy to sign contracts with whoever we want to purchase arms and the like, and so that is slightly different than making the argument against the UAE, basically a country that does not share borders or anything with Sudan, and sending arms to a militia that is committing atrocities. Now, the UAE in sending arms and supplies to the RSF is using, many of the Sudan's neighboring countries. As I mentioned earlier, including Libya, and now we know that Kenya is also involved, Uganda, South Sudan, and others. And so this is, this will continue to happen. And so unless we end that, unfortunately, we'll continue to see Al-Fashir time and again. Now, I'll just move quickly to some of the, action points. I think as a center, we've been focusing a lot on the targeting state and non-state actors. There are numerous sort of measures that we think will be very helpful. One is, initiating legal proceedings before the International Court of Justice against the states, particularly the UAE, for violation of international conventions. We know that Sudan, brought a case against the UN and was rejected, or actually dismissed last May, no, April, May, yes. And it was completely dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. But we still believe that the UAE can still be brought before the ICJ for other conventions, such as the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to which the UAE did not lodge any reservation. Of course, there are other conventions that we can trigger. The problem with this is that we've been engaging with many states, to sponsor and bring that case. But I think again it goes back to the lack of political will. So this is to say that even though there is an issue of political will, but I think there is a way to hold the states complicit in atrocities accountable. This is number one. Number two, we know that there are many corporate entities. For example, we know that the RSF's financial network, or maybe the business empire, is in the UAE, and those should be targeted for sure. One could be the targeted sanctions regime mentioned earlier by Sarah, but also through targeting the executives of those of some of the corporations that are involved in whether illicit gold trade or arms supplies and the like. For example, there is one of the major companies in the UAE, Global Service Group. I think essentially did an excellent report outlining how that company is involved in recruiting mercenaries and identifying a few or maybe two individuals linked to the UAE's political leadership. Those people can be targeted for their involvement in the atrocities in Sudan. So that is another thing. And I think finally, and this is, I know it was mentioned briefly, but also will be mentioned, I think, by the last speaker probably, the use of universal jurisdiction. I think it is really crucial now that we know many Sudanese have already fled the country, and they're now, whether they're in Africa or elsewhere, these can, the Sudanese can, these are victims and people are directly affected by the atrocities there. And so I think they can, play a critical role in initiating legal proceedings. And of course, if there are companies that can be linked to some of the Western jurisdictions, such as the BMP, the case that was flagged earlier today, I think it is something that can be really meaningful, not only in sense of holding them accountable, but also a way to remedy or address the victims that have endured serious grievances. So I think those are sort of multiple things that I have in mind. I'll leave it at that, but if you've got any questions, and of course, if there are any follow-ups, I'll be more than happy to elaborate. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you so much, Mutazim. It's really much appreciated that you've joined us here online and gave us these insights. I will then move to our last but not least speaker of the panel, which is Rodney Dixon, KC. He is a barrister at Temple Garden Chambers in London and The Hague. He specializes in public international law, international criminal law, and human rights and civil liberties, and he appears before international, regional, national courts. His work covers foreign relations, interstate disputes, the armed forces, and international prosecution and defense. He also has extensive experience with universal jurisdiction cases in multiple countries, and he will therefore talk about available legal avenues, including the mandate of the ICC, and explain the challenges surrounding universal jurisdiction cases, as we've already hinted at, and highlight some issues related to victim protection. So without further ado, Rodney, the floor is yours. I'll just pass you the mic.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers for, I think, highlighting what is at the moment a sort of staggering amount of inaction in all quarters. I just can't believe that if the kinds of gruesome atrocities that we see were taking place in Europe or in the West, that there'd be this little being done about it. We see statements being made. Our Foreign Secretary in the UK recently said there must be accountability, but absolutely nothing happens. And you talk about universal jurisdiction. Well, if you go to the police, I won't even say 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, they probably won't do anything to really take up the challenge of investigating and prosecuting, which I can't believe would happen if we saw these kinds of crimes on the streets here or in London or in Europe. So it is sobering knowing what our starting point is. And I want to offer some insights, having been somebody as a practitioner working in this area for some time, representing lots of different bodies and individuals, particularly in the Sudan situation, South Sudan as well, but looking at how these institutions work, what are the real possibilities internationally and nationally. I think it is important to go back to the 2 decades ago to when we got the Security Council referral, because maybe many of you weren't around there, but it was a big moment to get Russia and China not to abstain, and of course the US as well at that stage involved too. But of course they were very concerned why the US was suddenly wanting the ICC involved, because they weren't signed up, but they somehow managed to get that through. The first referral, which I don't think anyone thought would ever happen. We always thought it would happen through states or individual victims taking up cases. But when that happened, I think this is important to assess as well for the lessons now, how we use our opportunities now. There was a lot of criticism at the time about how it then evolved. We were in the time of Luis Ocampo, who was the prosecutor, and there were many who, even though they said that they thought there was overwhelming evidence against Bashir, didn't believe that he had put together a solid enough case on genocide. There was a lot of skepticism around the strength of the evidence. You recall he went straight, he announced it publicly, went straight to the pretrial chamber seeking genocide, and that was rejected. And then he had to take it on appeal. And that immediately set the process back. And on appeal, it was confirmed. But then all the rumors started circulating, as often happens in these situations, about how the court might be being politicized. And you can imagine then on the Security Council what the different interests might have been and the concerns were. Fortunately, we in fact got another referral in the case of Libya shortly thereafter. So they managed to keep it together, even though the concerns were growing. And that was also at a time when there was increasing criticism of the court because of a focus exclusively on Africa. Even though we see today Israel-Palestine very prominent at the ICC, at that time there were endless reports of atrocities going on back then already. In the 2000s, 2010, 2011, around this time, nothing was being done by the ICC at that point. And then you have set against that an indictment for genocide against Bashir. Then Ocampo moves on Libya, and then Kenya at the same time as well. And I've just given this a very short history in time at the ICC to show that at that particular point, there were huge pressures building on whether this agreement between the key powers to allow the ICC to deal with these matters could continue. In fact, when the Libya situation was finally resolved, the court didn't want any of those cases here in The Hague. They left them all in Libya to the surprise of many people. And I remember the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, from the UK at the time saying, well, really, it's now for Libya to deal with. The response to that of Russia and China, and I have no doubt that they have ulterior motives, but when Syria came along, they said, no, we gave you two, and we think there were serious problems with the way you dealt with both, including Sudan, and then Libya as well, where now you just left it to the parties there to deal with. You don't want to get involved at all. Now, I say that they maybe had other agendas, but that was the end of it. We never got a referral after that. Syria never came to the ICC. And I think it's partly because of the way in which Sudan and Libya were dealt with by the court and by those supporting the court. We need to, say, with that very brief overview, have that in mind for the way we try and deal with the situation now, to ensure that it is as depoliticized as possible, that investigations are as thorough and deep as possible, that they can't be accused of just, like, let's get a few reports together and charge somebody with genocide. Not that there isn't evidence out there, but you can't take shortcuts because it just undermines the credibility of the court and the power of the court to call on states to act. When you've got the evidence and you can show it, and I know you can't always make it all public, but people know, states know when the evidence is there, and they know when there have been shortcuts. It's so much harder for them to sidestep it. And also then look at all potential ways of cooperation with all the parties concerned, the current government, opposition groupings, civil society. It does need to be a very active, but as far as possible, depoliticized process to get the investigations, the charges out there, and support for the action that's taking place. So I think we do need to learn some lessons from that, because it hasn't gone anywhere, and of course it's been a lack of political will and inaction and all of that, but part of it has been contributed to the way the institutions have approached the problem as well. I think, therefore, two key features which shouldn't be lost in this, which I know have been highlighted, but I wanted to emphasize again, because very often they are not talked about, is the foreign involvement of outside actors. And there are many, but the primary one, as has been stressed, is the UAE, a very, very powerful and rich country that all of our governments do billions of dollars of trade with, own half of our buildings and our big cities as well. And therefore, it's very sensitive. The EU, I think just last week, didn't include the UAE in its resolution on Sudan. For that reason alone, there were a lot of articles about huge lobby groups going in to prevent that from happening. And we've got to make sure in the criminal justice sphere that in a totally unpolitical way, those who are behind the conflict are properly investigated. I think that is one key feature. It can't be just not talked about in order to try and ensure somehow that these sensitivities don't arise. A number of the people who I've worked with, or victims from the conflict, have said they believe that this would never have happened if you just didn't have that kind of money behind the conflict, that flooding in to be able to get the kinds of weapons that we're talking about, caches of weapons coming through Chad, using Libya as well, connections to Haftar and others, which links back to the earlier Security Council referral too, to get weapons in, but not only weapons in, also sometimes actual participation in the conflict. So the UAE involved in both the supply of drones, but then also the deployment of them in certain of the attacks as well. In addition to that, there are the commercial aspects that have been touched on. The deal, the quid pro quo, is that a lot of the gold in Darfur that the RSF has extensive control over, is channeled out through Chad onto the markets in Dubai. So allowing for smuggling going on at the same time. There are also a raft of crimes that can be investigated in that regard. And in the case of one of the persons I've actually represented, there's been direct involvement by the UAE in detention in Khartoum. So he was held in Khartoum, where he has identified persons from the UAE officials who were part of his detention. And we've provided that information. I mentioned the Foreign Secretary earlier, to the Foreign Office in the UK to sanction, but still no action being taken. In addition to that, we mustn't forget about the countries who are supplying the UAE with weapons that then end up in Sudan. There's been a recent expose about the number of UK weapons that were supplied, with the allegation being that a lot of that occurred after, so with knowledge of the way that they were being used. And it's not only the UK, but other countries as well. So these are key. They're not entirely unique features to any conflict, but they're very specific to what we're seeing unfolding, and allowing, being the engine, the fuel that allows this to get to the heightened levels that we've all been describing. And then secondly, the use of mercenaries as well. That has been touched on. I would recommend to take it shortly, so we have enough time for questions, you to look at the recent Sentry report, which did a brilliant expose of the Colombian mercenaries called the Desert Wolves that have been hired by a UAE-registered security company, which was set up by the Secretary General of the Presidential Court of the UAE. So this is the UAE Vice President, Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed, who happens also to be the owner of Man City in the UK. So you can see how the connections and the money flows. There has been a very good New York Times expose on this by Declan Welsh and others. But that is another feature of using these kinds of mercenaries to unleash the terror that has been experienced. Colombia has been very strong on condemning this. Maybe it's something where Colombia itself, as a state party of the ICC, could refer the matter if there's a need to extend the jurisdiction beyond Darfur, because I think that's accepted broadly as a limit within the referral, even though you can have legal arguments about that. I don't think necessarily if you refer a situation, you can say, well, it's only applicable in that part. But then there are other ways of getting around that through state referrals to ensure that the jurisdiction is as broad as possible. Lastly, then, let me just focus on universal jurisdiction, because that is an avenue through which a number of these investigations can be undertaken by our national authorities. Many countries have the capacity to do this, but also there are a number of possibilities when persons leave Sudan and are actually living abroad. In the UK, we've identified a number of persons who are regularly on social media congratulating people who have participated in the killing, spreading these awful, gruesome videos around, and encouraging others to do further acts. So those are matters that we're looking to take up, and I know in many other jurisdictions that is occurring. The difficulty is the appetite of national police forces to investigate these matters. One, you need to have investigated it as far as possible yourself beforehand. You need to approach it more like a private prosecution, as though you're ready to bring the case yourself. Because they simply won't start something from scratch. But then, even then, huge pressure has to be applied through all mechanisms, making it as public as possible. Where there is pressure to do something, very, very often, or the embarrassment factor will lead the police to take action. It's got so bad now, unfortunately, that we are starting to see some greater possibilities of things happening. So that is another very, very important avenue to pursue. So I would say investigation in the most thorough manner is key for the ICC, but likewise also for universal jurisdiction. We have to make sure that when we put forward these cases, we know who is responsible, of course, but it has to be backed up so that there can be no doubt, and that builds maximum pressure on action to take place. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rodney. I think that was very enlightening and very refreshing for all of us to have in mind these kind of more complex legal concepts, so to say. I'm a bit conscious of time, but I do want to open the floor for questions and comments. So if you have any, feel free to raise your hand, raise your glass, raise whatever you have on you. Do introduce yourself quickly if you want to add anything. Yeah, there's a hand there. I should have worn glasses maybe for this occasion.
Thank you very much. My name is Aine Neistat. I lead an organization called Interjust, which recently has taken over the work previously led by the docket at the Community Foundation for Justice. So hence some connection to Sudan. We as Interjust have not taken over Sudan work yet, but I'm here partially to consider whether that's something where we could add value. So, but we do have a lot of experience with universal jurisdiction cases specifically. So I have 3 questions. Each of them can be answered probably briefly or not. So my first one is specifically on universal jurisdiction. Those who are already heavily involved in the work on documentation, which jurisdictions are being under consideration for filing of the cases? And because obviously there are pros and cons on many of them. So it would be really good to hear if something is already on the table. The second one is, of course, survivors and witnesses. My understanding that, unlike, for example, the cases that we're leading on Ukraine, there are immense risks and obviously much, much more reluctance from witnesses and survivors to participate. So how can we overcome that in a proceeding that cannot really be anonymized beyond a certain point? And my other 2 questions are, one is related. So that's obviously the dilemma that we're facing in Ukraine case as well. Sanctions versus universal jurisdiction cases, right? Because either you try to get people on sanctions list so that they cannot travel, or you try to avoid them being prevented from travel so that they can travel and we can be eventually apprehended, right? So just, I understand the value of both approaches, but in some ways it's one or the other, and I'm keen to hear from you. And the last one, very specific technical question. All of the evidence coming out of RSF itself, the videos, I understand that CIR is one of the organizations, Center for Information Resilience, that is sort of capturing it. Are there any others who are actually saving, archiving all of that at the moment? Because it sounds like it might be a matter of time until it starts disappearing. So I'm curious whether anybody's fully on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an extensive list. I'm happy to take your questions as well and then pass them all back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to this panel. My name is Julie Bardesh and I work at Redress. I'm a senior legal advisor there. The panel was really excellent and touched upon so many issues. It was really enlightening. So thank you for all of this, to all of the speakers and the organizers. I just wanted to highlight a paper that was prepared by our partner, International Federation for Human Rights on Accountability Avenues for Sudan. And I think a lot of the avenues that you touched upon were very much mentioned and probably drawing quite a bit from that paper. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a question on how do you see that we can as civil society actors, mobilize more support for the accountability measures and mechanisms that we're envisaging for Sudan, for the reparation mechanisms. We're seeing, obviously, in a conflict of a very different nature, a lot of mobilization for Ukraine, mechanisms for reparation, a tribunal for aggression, a joint and investigative team which was set up at Eurojust in order to investigate those crimes. And we would very much like to see a similar mobilization for that huge crisis, yet we're still not seeing it. we are cognizant of the very different nature of the two conflicts and the different political dynamics that underlie them, but still, what are some of the techniques that we could apply for more pressure in order to support those mechanisms? And I believe that one focus that perhaps was not mentioned in this room is another type of enabler, which perhaps is there's also value to focus on, and these are the people who are encouraging hate crime from abroad in diaspora communities. And here I'll point to Mariana Goetz, who is in this room, to Monai Madam, because they've been very much working on this. And perhaps you can share a little bit of your experiences working on this and how there is value in also pursuing those actors for accountability.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any other hands for the moment, so I will pass back to the panel. Maybe I will start with the question on how to mobilize support for accountability as civil society. I don't know who wants to. I think it was kind of towards Sarah, so if you want to start, go ahead, please.
Certainly, and I think that ties in a little bit to one of the other questions. I think a couple of things are key. I think if we simply look at what all of the legal and human rights organizations and civil society did in response to Ukraine, the letters, the petitions, the offering to run programs, I think that's key. I think putting together similar proposals for whatever program, whether it's victim protection, training programs, legal reform, establishing things, essentially everything that was done for Ukraine, the funding that was provided by governments to NGOs and CSOs for programs on accountability and justice for Ukraine, make those same requests to the governments and point out what they've done in regards to Ukraine and the urgent need to do it. And, you know, basically just the models are there. And I think it just takes the groups really pressuring the governments and insisting that if governments are truly going to be equitable as to justice and accountability and human rights and uphold their own obligations, they cannot pick and choose which atrocities they're going to offer help and assistance and protection for. So that's really, I don't have a magic wand, but that's really my best advice on that.
Okay, then I think I'm going to move to the bunch of universal jurisdiction question around that were posed by Interjust. Maybe Rodney, you would like to get started on those, and then if the rest wants to add, feel free.
Yes, thanks. I think you can go through a whole range of different options here with different countries. One of the key considerations, though, is whether the person is on the territory or about to come there. From my experience in a lot of different countries, if there's no reasonable prospect of the person actually coming there, then it's a very easy way for the police to shut it down. Once they've touched down once, then in a lot of jurisdictions, particularly some of the civil law jurisdictions, it's easier to keep the proceedings going. So that's the key, to find out where people are and where they're going, because that then does create a lot more of an increased possibility that the police will take action if they're right there under their noses. With regard to comparing sanctions to travel, you often get this question. I mean, the problem is that the chances of national police arresting somebody, putting them in trial, are so slim. So, holding back so that maybe somebody will come. You just think, look, we've got to try and get something. If we could just get somebody on a sanctions list, that is at least a start. So tend to go for whatever you can get to get something. I mean, I don't want to sound like too desperate, but very often you've got to try and see what is the way to turn the screw somewhere as quickly as you can.
Hi, on the archiving question, I think Mnemonic is still archiving, so I would reach out to them. So I understand CIR is doing much the same, but I know Mnemonic has quite a professional database that organizations can access. On the universal jurisdiction cases, I think, Manayam, you have opinions on this too, but the one thing, and you've probably assessed this while you were at CFJ, is that I think the flows of perpetrators to Europe is actually lower than in other conflicts. Of course, Russia, you have people moving because it's in you're already in Europe, but even less so than probably in the Syrian context. So many perpetrators I would expect to be in neighboring countries. And so you'd probably be looking more at some of the regional mechanisms or, UJ cases in neighboring countries. And Monem was saying today that you'd face real security risks there. And I'm not sure, Monem, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you want to jump in on that. Or I can summarize what you said, which is essentially, I'll summarize. There's targeting of people in Kenya, for example. Kenya in particular, Uganda is also quite a dangerous environment for human rights defenders. So I would just bear that in mind as you were doing some of the scoping. And that I think relates to your question on sort of the witness protection. I mean, the court, the ICC, I don't think we have a perfect way of doing this. Informed consent is obviously one, just telling people of the risks. I think the other is probably trying to bring witnesses farther from the camps, especially, for example, if you're in Chad. So doing interviews at a distance, at a remove, because the camps in Chad where you have many victims are a really dangerous environment, I think. And it would be very difficult to do an investigation unnoticed. So yeah, just some quick reflections on that.
Because I see him nodding heavily, I think Mutasim, do you have, if you want to comment to any of the other questions?
Thanks a lot. No, I think my point was already mentioned by him. I think the idea was to focus on the neighboring countries, and I think we've been in touch with some of the groups, particularly in Kenya, and of course in South Africa as well. Those are places where you can surely consider for universal jurisdiction, but again, all the concerns that were just mentioned are real. Um, uh, Although South Africa and Kenya are relatively, sort of safer countries in the region, but still we know that there is a repression against human rights defenders and civil society groups that are working on accountability front. It is something that people have to consider. I think another angle is that Kenya is also host for hundreds of thousands of Sudanese for a long time, not only just during this conflict. And so a lot of people may be concerned, sort of angering the authorities in Kenya. And that is another challenge that people have to keep in mind. But surely, yes, those are places that you would like to think for universal jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to look around the room one last time. Yes, I see a hand. Do come.
Hi, I'm Prachiti. I'm a legal advisor with Global Rights Compliance, and I have a sort of more wide-ranging general question for the panel, which is so much of food for thought, but with issues such as the need for a robust investigation, as well as issues with, documentation and evidence not being able to be stored, evidence being lost. I'm sort of wondering that whether we're facing this risk of, in this urge to preserve evidence and information, we now face the risk of trying to preserve things as they are right now, but then down the line having to reinvestigate, redocument, and sort of opening ourselves to the issue of over-documentation. And so I'm just sort of wondering if there are any thoughts on how we can potentially avoid that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Gonna do a last. Yes, I see. Okay. Yes, I think I saw your hand first, and then I'll move to the back.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Munaim Adam. I am a lawyer and a senior advisor for the Sudan Human Rights Hub. Thank you for the panelists, really, for the great discussion and all the highlights that we learned a lot, I think, as well, from all the points you mentioned. I wanted to make really kind of comments quickly on three topics, and I can try to make them really very quickly. First of all, I think really the comment about the sanction versus universal jurisdiction cases. I mean, generally, we don't see the Sudanese kind of potential belligerents troubling to any places that way. I think potentially having cases of universal jurisdiction, and I really totally agree with you that I think doing anything kind of at least establish deterrent is really important at the moment. We cannot wait for something to be done for the future. Yeah, but I think it is important as well too. We have the same approach when it comes to evidence. For example, now as well, kind of addressing, I think some of the one of the point that Julie mentioned regarding the combating hate speech really to the lowest level on social media. For example, part of the work we are doing with the Meta as a, just like to reduce the content from online, just like part of the content moderation. Sometimes we try to preserve the evidence before we send it to them, the report to be dismissed from the online platform. And that I think sometimes really we have to make sure that we collect this. So we created a locally owned archive. That's really kind of as well to make sure that evidence are collected, preserved for future accountability. We're facing a lot of challenges with that as well, kind of like where these archives will be hosted. For now, we're hosting this archive at Amazon. We don't know about kind of like, you know, a lot of, last year we did a really great effort with the some US-based institutions, and now that archive kind of gone because it was part of the support from the State Department, and they kind of really issued kind of like part of the executive order that's supposed to be dismissed, and it was dismissed completely. I mean, I can talk about that later, but separately, but that's one. So I think as well, kind of like evidence, I think as well, one of the questions you raised about like archives as well, the Sudan Human Rights Hub has kind of like created an archive from 2023 until today after the war, preserving now more than 37 pieces of evidence from open source mostly. Is really kind of an initiative led by local groups to make sure that these evidence are collected and preserved for future accountability. And as well, because we don't know if any evidence kind of like hosted by another organization, how long they are going to be able to host that, or how long is going to be available for Sudanese to be used. And as well, if that evidence kind of like, because of different organizations have different standards, some, you know, to some degree, sometimes they refuse to make this evidence available to be used for other things rather than their own, like, for example, either cases or to share it with the ICC and things like that. However, they're like, yeah, very great international organization hosting some really kind of like evidence that host, you know, like they really can meet a very high threshold, like mnemonic and others. And I think other kind of, I think there is a potential too with eyewitness application, because it has the closed source, you know, approach. I think that can as well help to have this as well be for future accountability. I think just the point that you mentioned with regard to safety for people who are engaged in universal jurisdiction in the region. I think different people share their opinion, but I think really we've been engaged with within the region of East Africa with a lot of states and prosecutions, especially Uganda and Kenya. They were kind of very open to consider this, but I think mentioned by different people here too, this is really risky for anyone to be involved in a case filing, especially if they're based in East Africa, because I think Mu'tasim spoke about how some of the actors kind of like very close aligned with Kenya and others, and I think this really can put someone at risk. We saw a lot of organizations advocating for something like that to, you know, speak with local actors and bring cases, but I think really this can cause more harm than good for that time being. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for picking up on the questions again, and I think it's much appreciated to hear an actual human rights defender's voice in this. That's very nice. And then, without further ado, I want to pass to the gentleman in the back to keep your question.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Muhammad Adam Hassan. I'm Executive Director of the Fund for Human Rights. Thank you so much for being here. This is the opportunity really to highlight the situation of Sudan, especially the Darfur region. For me, my organization is the focus in the Darfur region as grassroots organization. So I know you highlight situations, but for me, I want to make sure that I want to addition. It is the situation is in Darfur region is not just like normal situation as really I want to tell you, because like, for example, Al-Fashir, since 26th of October up to now, no one have any information about inside Al-Fashir, what's happening going on. So, and I know as grassroots organization, we are receive it that those victims or survivors who left the Fashir came in a different place in Darfur region. What they told us really and is unable to speak now about the situation there, because what we see in after RSF they attacked the Fashir, the sieging, Fashir sieging more than uh, 18 months or 19 months. This is the really a lot of the violation happening, and drone and bombing and shelling, and also starvation of the civilian, especially women and children. Most of them died because even when you see in the survivors, they eating the animals' food. It's called umbas. Umbas, this food for the animals, because feed for animals. So after RSF, they come and they attack the Fashir, more than 10,000 civilians. Up to now, most of them, they put them in detention center. As the Fund Network for Human Rights, we are mapping, we find 16 places inside the Fashir. This place, the RSF put detention. And every day, more than 10 persons died by torture, by hunger. Some of them, they lack of the health service, because this is uh, 19 months. A lot of civilian who are wounded and there, and also no any humanitarian service or health service to allow to entering in Al Fashir. So those, when the RSF come in, immediately finish for them. Because, for example, we have 15 women from the hospital of Sudia. I think hospital of Sudia. This is the hospital. They hosted a lot of the people on wounded. So these women, their RSF captured them and took them another place. It's called in Minaberry. This Minaberry, these women, they raped them. 2 women died by rapes. Let's see. Now, this is morning I talk with my my friend Ima. Between Fashir and Tawila, now thousand of body now in the bush. So no one come to take them, because our team and some civil society organization and CCRC, we are gathering, we are talking about this. We started to gathering those body from between Fashir and Tawila. Even we are unable to collect those all mass graves. So, and another thing, the RSF now we have like 4,000 children. Those who crossed to the going to Tawila, they recruited them and sent them to the Libya, and they became soldiers and coming back to fighting in Darfur. So and also now thousands of detention in Niala is called Tigres. So those are civilian. So RSF and leave it people in area controlling by RSF. So RSF now put domestic rule. Special community leaders, they cannot speak about anything inside in Darfur region area controlling. Because this morning, my team sent me email, RSF enforced community leaders to come back in a Fashir. They want to, a lot of body, they want to hide in this body and to banning them. I want to cover the crimes of crime against of humanity for this civilian. And also again, now, especially in Kalmakam, we have 2 organizations working, Allied Organization and MSF. RSF, they come to enforce the allies. If you want to support those IDBs, 50% the service to go to the RSF, 50% to service to go to the civilian. Because this is the now RSF even to enforce international organizations around now in Darfur region, they to force them to treatment those fighters of the RSF. So most of the medicine RSF to give treatment for their fighters. And civilian here, we have a lot of gap of the health service. So this is the one of thing. For example, I'm very happy Sarah speak about the we need to expansion of the university jurisdiction. Yes, for me from Darfur, we started in Darfur in 2003. I was 16 years this time. I was 16 years. So in 16 years, up to now, we're now 23 years. In 23 years, we've seen all the justice, we see Ali Kosheb in a court, How can justice to be done? In 2023, we see huge of human rights violations going on. What? 20 years waiting for the justice. Now repeat again. Hope. How? So my organization from 2023 up to now documenting 10,000 cases of human rights violation, including sexual violence, including ransom, including torture, including those the unlaw killing, and including people who they lost distractions. Firstly, we have 3,000 cases of people civilian from 2023 up to now. Firstly, one of the worst area, crime committed, drone, self-bombing, RSF make drone, and every day we lost. Finally, Fashir now became like totally like Rwanda. We seen our colleagues underground seen. Body still now in Fashir, no one collects them. So that's really, I'm thinking for the extension, the university jurisdiction, I think this is really one of things, key area we can think in how to collaborate in this area. Because now, my office in Kampala, most of the victims can report us, the perpetrators right now in Kampala. A person from the Fashir, they report us, tell us person who's commit my crime. He's commander in RSF right now in Kampala. So I think this is the opportunity because we can see how the collaboration, because I see ICC, yes, they take process, and as the professor said, we know the ICC now a lot of challenge we've seen, even US put sanction. And so, but for university jurisdiction, I think this is the key area we can focus because we see the victims of Darfur. You cannot waiting 20 years, waiting 20 years ago, and now waiting for the ICC to can make justice. Yes, we believe ICC can make justice, but a lot of challenge, but we can see how we can make support, rapid support for this situation of the civilian of Darfur. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment, and also thank you very much for the more than vital work that your organization is doing on the ground. I think we can all sit here comfortably discussing things, but at the end of the day, that kind of work is what matters and what gets us results. And also your resilience is very inspiring, hearing that you were 16 when this war started. But I think we also need to acknowledge that even though the resilience has been absolutely inspiring, the resilience will not be enough. Then we need to seriously advance accountability. I will really quickly pass on the question on over-documentation so that we get it answered, and then I will think I'll wrap up because I really do not want to keep you much longer than necessary.
Yeah, to the question on documentation, I mean, others may have views, but I think it's an interesting question and relates to what I meant about why you're documenting it for a purpose. Because, for example, the ICC discourages people from taking full witness statements because it does create a problem where if say a witness that you had interviewed then progressed to an interview at the ICC, there's a great risk of discrepancy because all of that would need to be disclosed in the case of an eventual trial. So, but on the other hand, you may have one opportunity to document a witness or a victim's story. And so I think there is this real tension in the purpose of documentation. I think part of it is thinking through, okay, how can you document the most amount of information with the least possibility for discrepancy? The second is, I mean, in the case you don't have possible ICC jurisdiction at the moment, I would say, well, then in that case, more is probably better. Although, again, the Met, for example, SO15 doesn't want witness statements either for the same reason. So I think it's sort of thinking through the strategy of where you hope something might go, even if, okay, the SO15 is not going to take up the case. What might they prefer? What might the ICC be looking for? Are you trying to tell a story more than you are documenting for accountability? I'm sure you already know this, and so it's not a particularly helpful answer, but that was definitely something we faced at the ICC, sort of bizarrely in the position of telling people to document less, which is sort of hard to explain and doesn't make that much sense in some ways, but makes perfect sense in others. I'm not sure if others have thoughts on that too.
Just briefly, and to echo what Emma just said, but I think the other thing that's so vital to keep in mind is re-traumatization. Especially, and I think the international protocol, especially when you're talking about sexual violence and working with and interviewing victims and witnesses, but I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. But I think that's also why we need a more coordinated approach so that we can decide, what are the cases that we're going to look for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or restorative justice efforts versus, criminal court accountability.
Only add that too many statements can lead to contradictions as well, not because people are not telling the truth, but because when you recall things over different periods of times, you do often get problems emerging, which can then later on be used against a person. So that should be taken into account as well. And then lastly, just looking for the right kinds of witnesses. I think there's going to be so many people on the ground who've been affected, but trying to find those who are going to know something about who was in charge and who was responsible higher up. There might be people also coming out of the perpetrator group because they can't deal with what's happened and confessing. Those kind of insider whistleblowers are critical. And I think no matter what the circumstances are, getting that evidence down is critical. You can always use that evidence as well, even if the witness doesn't come later on. The rules are quite flexible for admissibility. So it's a balance to strike between all those factors.
I've seen one more little hand over there, so please go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Iman Saifuddin. I am from International Community Care Chairperson. I would like to thank the panel for the information that has been discussed here, and as well to greet my friend Mu'tasim through the Zoom. I just would like to make some reflections on Sudan case, because now people are kind of mixing to speak about Darfur alone or Sudan in general. And I think to detangle these issues, there is so many problems that we need to look at. And getting back to the history of Darfur, I was more than 20 years back lobbying for this, being in the United States and Germany and so many countries, just to speak about what is going on and lobby for some sanctions. For example, we have lobbied for Darfur non-fly zone. We approached President Bush and so many officials, and events were there for more than 500 top officials, decision makers of the world, and so forth. My experience regarding sanctions, there were some sanctions that are not effective in some Sudanese personnel, like, for example, when they sanction Musa Hilal. He doesn't have bank accounts, he doesn't travel abroad. He was not affected, and he continued killing people. And then again, I think there is a gap between the Security Council resolutions and what is going on the ground, because its resolutions have never been applied. Darfur has been for the long time being at war, and as well Sudan. The protracted conflict that continued in Darfur and Sudan, South Sudan, are very well documented. I mean, not in the issue of International Criminal Court, but this is also another failure. I was just coming from my speech there, that because 20 years of having a case in the process is quite very long, that it's not accepted for any kind of things. And I think the International Criminal Court is not assessing their work, because if it is not working for 5-10 years, then they have not to continue the same way for 20 years, because now we lost millions of lives now. We have like more than 20 million have fled the country because of the militia still active. I would like also to speak about Tawila, for example. All the black people that have been targeted by the genocide have fled to Tawila, Jabal Mara, and these areas. Now they are subjected, or they are target of the militia to commit another mass killing and genocide on those people, because they were the target of the militia at the initial base. And decision makers doesn't take this into account. People are feeling fear of being attacked once again by the same militia, even in Tawila, Jabal Marra, Golo, because like, for example, if we're taking Golo, Golo was a small city or county, and then now it has more than 2 million inhabitants out of a sudden, because of the people are migrating from Fashar, Niala, and other cities, and people need to think about these issues. Again, I think valuable review of peace processes that has always been mixed with ceasefire and military operations. That I think the architecture of peace processes are always not satisfactory, because if you revise all the peace agreements that have been signed, you find that people have been brought to the table to sign peace ceasefire agreement, then they come to power sharing and wealth sharing. This is a process that it acts like upheaval for more recruitment, for more militias. It opened the appetite of those people who are carrying guns to oppress the civilians, those who doesn't have any activism on military issues or factions. And I mean, even in armed groups that claim that they are liberation movement or whatever, but they are all, when they get into the table, this is, it's like opening appetite of them to control more, taking money, involved in business rather than in politics, and forgetting the slogans that they have raised at the first place. And that is why I think if we would like to look at the situation for a comprehensive peace process or detangling what is going on, we have absolutely to separate the military ceasefire operations and integration of the militias or disarmament, because we don't have only the parallel armies or RSF that is very active now, but we have every single tribe in Sudan has its military faction, be it in the north or south or west or anywhere. And that is a great terror to any peace agreement or sustainability of any agreement or political processes. And that is why people need to look at that separate from any political negotiation. And then also in political negotiation, people are inviting Sudanese politicians, but they don't classify who is a politician and who's military, because the armed movements, they have armies, but still they come and share the voice with the civilians, which is, it's not comparable. You have arms and then you want to share with me also the politics, and you force me with your arms to say yes or no to whatever you like. This is the dimension, and this is the game that is in the politics. And I think we cannot accept for those who claim that they have armed groups to still act like having arms, but getting into political negotiations, because the peace agreements with those people have failed ever and ever, in Abuja, in Juba, wherever. And that's why I think the strategy of having everlasting peace also should be changed and should be looked in a different dimension. I think also there is one organization that worked a lot in documenting, and I was like also assisting on these things, is the the connections of money and assets of the militias and their companies, their allies, their wherever. It's a C4Ads organization. They have very authentic reports that I personally participated with them or coordinated with them for a very long time to collect their evidences. And I think this is crystal clear what is happening and who is who and which kind and amount of money is circulating outside the international monetary system. I think also I also put my voice to the idea that we need actually to extend the jurisdictions of the even ICC or international jurisdictions on prosecuting the case in Sudan, because the same crimes have been perpetrated in Al Jazeera, in Medini, Durman, and other states. And there is still, and they are still going on and on. I think also there is one international jurisdiction, so I think the arms control regime. This will tell us, and if we are acting this one, we could find, we could also hold states responsible. And we had a debate yesterday that maybe the states, actually the muscular states, will not be happy to go on this avenue, but still this avenue, it's one of the instruments that can hold them to stop dealing with Emirates further, because okay, if tit for tat or whatever, for the decision makers to play it, because you cannot sustain Emirates with arms making genocide and still you want to make business with the same entities, and your arms are there. And there is tangible also reports on the arms that are there in Sudan, be it from UK, from Germany, from different countries, which is, it's serious, I think, and we need to look at the arms control regime to find out who is these arms belong to. I thank you very much. I think it was a very tough day for me, but I think maybe if we have more time anywhere, we can discuss further in the issue. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your extensive comments and for that kind of reality check of letting us know what works and what does not work effectively, and for this showcasing this deep militarization in the country and what that means for peace processes, and for bringing up some more concrete solutions on universal jurisdiction. It's much appreciated. Because I really do not want to keep you any longer, and because we've really gone, I think, quite a lot over time. Thank you very much for coming and for contributing to the discussion. Thank you very much again to our speakers for taking the time and coming. Thank you for everybody who was involved in organizing this. It's truly been a group effort. I think we can all take something home from this discussion, whether it's on humanitarian access, localization, universal jurisdictions, prevention, external actors. I've certainly learned a lot still today. So I hope you did as well, and I wish you a lovely rest of your evening.